Hey, what's going on everybody? Jason Frausto for TennisUnleashed.net. And in this video, I'm breaking down the forehand technique of Carlos Alcaraz step by step and checkpoint by checkpoint. If you want to find out what the keys to Alcaraz's forehand are, stay tuned. It's coming up next. All right, so let's jump into the analysis now, right? We got Alcaraz here, footage on the left side of the screen and then also on the right side of the screen. So left side of the screen is from Cincinnati 23. We got some Indian Wells footage here from just a little while ago, 2 years ago, I think, from the back view over here from 12 KGP Tennis on this side of the screen. So let's kind of jump in and analyze this. Before we do the actual analysis, I will let it play once in slow motion so you can see the stroke itself and just kind of see the technique. And now we'll jump in and actually break this thing down. We're going to start with step one in the process, right? Which is really the ready position of Alcaraz. So all pros have similar ready positions for the most part, especially on the men's side of the tour. What we see with most players, right, is left hand, the non-dominant hand, will be on the throat of the racket in what I call an upper, mid, or lower position. So we have the throat of the racket right here, right? And when I train players, I train them to either grab high, mid, or low. And I leave that decision up to them a little bit as far as what they prefer. But Alcaraz waits in a higher, throat position here where he's grabbing. Again, I like to give players an option of where they actually grab when I'm training players on the court. And then if we look at the forehand grip here for Alcaraz, right, he's waiting in a forehand grip with his dominant hand. So he's going to switch over if he has to for any reason to a backhand grip if it comes to his backhand side. But just again, right here, waiting in that position. You'll notice that when he's waiting in this position, the racket head is actually off to his backhand side in case he has to hit his backhand. He's preparing for a forehand, but if it comes to his backhand side, he's tilted towards the backhand side because it helps him prepare to hit a backhand if it comes to that side for some reason. The next thing that we're going to look at a little bit here is the split step. A little bit tough on both screens to see the width of his actual split step here, but we can see he's well past shoulder width on the right side of the screen right here, even though I know he's not quite in frame, but we want to get those feet past shoulder width apart when we're split stepping on our forehand, and he does that successfully here. Next thing, moving from that position, right? Off the split, the first thing that we see, common term for this, is the unit turn of the body. So left hand remains on the throat of the racket right here. The right hand here still in a forehand position grip, right? Because he knows he's getting a forehand at this point. And what he's doing is leaving the left hand on the throat of the racket while he turns his upper body and lower body, right? So he's turning his hips and his shoulders all together as one unit. Very important, keeping the hands together while he turns his hips and his shoulders. Now, some differences between Alcaraz and the forehands that we see, maybe with a Federer, Nadal at this stage, the amount of tilt that Alcaraz has. So his racket moving forward like this on both sides of the screen, we can see that tilt. And then another big difference that we see is how far away his elbow, his hitting elbow here, gets away from his body. Now, for most players, when they're preparing their forehands, I like to see most players have a little bit of space here between their elbow and their body, but I don't want to see that space become gigantic where the elbow really lifts up and away from the body. So I like to see a couple tennis balls worth of space here in the beginning from the body, and then as we turn, I don't usually like to see the elbow lift up this much because it takes a long time to get out of that position and get back to the hitting position. But Alcaraz really lifts his elbow up and away, which causes the racket to tilt and point more forward than a lot of players on the tour, right? This has been called the next gen forehand. It's a little excessive. It's unnecessary to do this, but that's what Alcaraz does. Comfortable with it. The next thing we want to notice here, right? We talked about the unit turn, really turning the upper body and the lower body together. We can see at this position, the belly button should be facing to the right if we're right-handed, left if we're left-handed, if we've got a proper turn on the forehand side. We should see that belly button going that way, as well as the hips in that direction, okay? Then from that position right here, we've noticed over the last 5 to 10 years, Federer really popularized kind of the half loop forehand. We've got guys like Fonini who have almost no loop on their forehand, but for somebody like Alcaraz, he's got a pretty high loop. His right hand comes up above his shoulder, and you kind of have to question is, as the game gets more, fast in the years to come and Sinner's really raised the bar for speed of shots and, on the tour, you have to kind of question, will this hand height hurt him 5 or 10 years from now when the game is even faster than it is right now? He could always shorten this up, but again, pretty high loop, right hand getting above his shoulder on that ball. And then from this position, right, can also see that he holds on to the throat of the racket longer than a lot of the players do. He really gets his upper body coil and holds his left hand on the throat of the racket right here. And he doesn't let go of it until it gets to about his back shoulder. And that's when he's going to release it right there, right? Pretty far back, even beyond the shoulder a little bit. But that's when he actually releases the non-dominant hand from the racket. At this point, what we can see is when he releases, and even just before, a little tough to see from this angle, maybe on the right here, but his front shoulder, right, the left shoulder, is coiled and turned past the back shoulder. So he's really, really turned his upper body a ton here. He's got more turn on that front shoulder than he does on the back shoulder. So he's really coiling his body on the shot. It reminds me kind of like, somebody throwing a haymaker in boxing, or somebody throwing a shot put and really turning to prepare for the shot. So again, from here, the next thing that we notice is because of Alcaraz's grip, his racket strings tend to point off to the side. This is pretty typical, what we see on the tour with a lot of players having somewhat similar grips for the most part, but we can see pointed off to the side here, just like his body is. From that position, the racket will start to come down, and Alcaraz hits a straight arm forehand just like Rafa and just like Federer. Dimitrov also straight arm forehand. Guys like Fernando Verdasco also had hit with a straight arm forehand. A throwback for you, Peredur Shisha, a guy from a long time ago, probably 20 plus years ago at this point, also had a straight arm forehand 20 to 25 years ago, was a good player with a big forehand. So from here, we can see when Alcaraz drops the racket, right, we get into the topic of racket leg and how to set up the ATP style racket leg forehand. And he's doing that right here. So here's how he does it. He lets go with the non-dominant hand. He plants into a semi-open stance on these particular forehands. And if you want more data on forehand stances, I have all the data from the top players in the world as far as what percentage are hit from a semi-open stance, a neutral stance, a closed stance, and an open stance on forehands. You can check that out in our forehand course on tennisunleashed.net if you want that specific data to tell you exactly, hey, how often are they hitting from these stances in those situations? But semi-open stance right here, guys. And then from that position, he loads his body by bending his knees, right? So we can see all the bending here. And if you wonder what app I'm using here, I'm using On Form for this analysis. So again, here, okay, he plants. And then from this position, we start to see his right arm go from a bent position right here, and it's going to get into a straight position as his racket comes down like this. Now, here are a couple keys to hitting the ATP forehand and setting this up, right? Number one, we know the racket has to be tilted off to the right of our hitting hand when we set this up. So we want this to be tilted off to the right when we do this. It's mandatory, kind of required to really get a large amount of like leg and snap on it, okay? The second part that's really key, and it can be a little tough to see on this side of the screen, is that hitting arm needs to be relaxed, but your right hand really needs to be, your wrist and hand need to kind of straighten out and get relaxed in that position. And we can actually see on the left side of the screen here, look at how his wrist is kind of straight at this point. It's relaxed. And that's going to allow his racket to kind of snap back and flip back as he goes to turn his body and his waist and his hips, everything here. But again, watch. The wrist is in a strong, more upright position initially right here. We see that in both frames, right? The wrist is in a stronger position until he gets towards the bottom of his swing, and you can see the wrist goes from that strong position to more of a neutral or relaxed position, and it makes it easier to get that big leg on your forehand. So he really does that really well. We also notice here, right, that his right leg, as this starts to happen, his right leg starts to extend up off the ground. So he's using ground force, pushing off the ground to generate a lot of pace on this shot, and that's key as well. So look at that right leg really go from here. If we use the overlay right feature here, we can see that really starts to straighten up and it starts to extend, okay? So he's using the ground force here to generate pace and also to generate rhythm within the stroke. That's also super important. But again, racket is off to the right side of the hitting hand here. The right wrist starts to relax at this point. His legs start to push off the ground and he starts to rotate his body. And what we see here is one of the biggest keys in the forehand that I talk about all the time. And that's the tip of your racket, this part right here, needs to get behind your hitting elbow to have a super big whip of the tip and forehand leg on the shot. And that's what he achieves, something that Nadal achieved, Federer achieved. All the best forehands in the world get the tip of the racket behind the hitting elbow before the racket drives forward. That means the racket's moving a very long distance in a short period of time, which means we have a lot of racket head speed for a lot of power, okay? So again, from here, it comes forward and we achieve this position. One small detail I want to talk about a little bit that's kind of an anomaly with Alcaraz, you don't see it with that many players, is the non-hitting hand and arm when it comes off his throat of his racket right here. He does something that's a little bit unique to him, and not a lot of players do this. You go back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 15, 10 years ago, all pros and all instructors typically taught players to take their left arm here, and when they got it off the throat of the racket and they released, they wanted people to get their left arm completely straight. And that's still, for the most part, something that most players do. But Alcaraz actually never achieves a straight arm with his left arm. You can see it remains bent, right, from here. It's pretty unique to him for the most part. And then his arm just pulls in as it would for any other player. Now, the one danger of this, and I'm not saying he should change his forehand. I think it's great the way it is, except for that high elbow take back. But one danger of this, at least for players that are learning and developing, younger players, is if you don't get your left arm straight, a lot of times players will get too close to the tennis ball at contact and they get jammed by it. So for a lot of younger players, I do like them to eventually try to straighten it out. If they have issues with their spacing, most players will hit the ball outside of where that left arm stretches out to, and Alcaraz is no exception. You can see as it clears, look at where his contact is right here, okay? And if we look where his left arm was reaching out to, somewhere in this area right here. So the contact is outside of where that hand is, but he's pretty unique in the fact that he does not get his left arm completely straightened out. Most players do that or get pretty close to it. From this point right here, guys, see a couple of things. That left arm pulls out and away as he gets that leg on the forehand side. We see the butt cap of the racket is pointed basically at the ball at this stage, which happens naturally if you execute the leg correctly. And then also really on the right side of the screen, really watch here how the legs straighten out, right? And this guy's getting off the ground on both of these forehands, right? He's throwing his body into shots. And then at contact, we see a couple of interesting things here that people can learn from. Number one, I'm looking for most players consistently, unless we're late on a shot or we're in defense, the hitting elbow should be in front of the body at contact, right? And we can see that on the left side of the screen. The hitting elbow should also be away from the body and have a gap between it and the body. The tip of the racket should typically be down a little bit at contact if we're trying to hit with heavy spin. If we're trying to flatten it out, the tip of the racket will be more level with the hitting hand. You can see on the right here, it's a little bit down from his hitting hand right here. And then from that position right here, the body, right? The alignment of the body, head in line with the hips, good balance, body extended. At this stage as well, that belly button should be facing forward to the net as it is in both frames. Typically, the right shoulder should be lower than the left shoulder, and the shoulders and chest should be facing the net as they are at contact right here. And that left arm, again, should really pull into the body, help with the rotation. We get this great contact right here. And then as Alcaraz follows through, right, we can really see here's his contact with his hand. And again, it depends on your intent with the ball, like what you're trying to do with your shot. But watch his hand as it goes forward and across. Look at the extension he got in this particular forehand right here. Quite a bit of extension as he goes across and wipes with the windshield wiper. So many players, junior players, will take the hand at contact and have almost no extension consistently on shots, and then wonder why they can't penetrate the court. It's because you're not going across and through at the same time. I'm not saying you always need to do that, but if you're trying to penetrate the court, you're going to have to go across and through at the same time to do that, and Alcaraz does that right here. We can see his strings of his racket. We'll kind of make this windshield wiper motion here, right? Path of the racket across. And typically as we do that, our strings will point towards our opponent in that direction as we're wiping across, just like that. And then we finish and land on the opposite foot and get ready to recover. The follow through can really vary per shot and per player, right? So he's got a pretty good follow through on this particular shot just here. and he's really rotated his body in this situation, but for some players that follow through can vary a little bit. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this side-by-side analysis video and breakdown of Carlos Alcaraz's forehand. If you found this video helpful or you feel like you learned something today, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. I'm Jason Frausto for tennisunleashed.net. I'll see you next time.